Isaiah 55, verses 1 through 9. Hear the word of the Lord. Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. And you that have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without price. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me and eat what is good. Delight yourselves in rich food. Incline your ear and come to me. Listen so that you may live. I will make an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David. See, I made him a witness to the peoples, a leader and commander for the peoples. See, you shall call nations that you do not know, and nations that do not know you shall run to you. Because Yahweh, your God, the Holy One of Israel, he has glorified you. Seek Yahweh while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake their way and the unrighteous their thoughts. Let them return to Yahweh that he may have mercy on them. To our God, for he will abundantly pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways, says Yahweh. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. What is God's will? It's a question I have heard more times than I care to remember. I've heard it applied to career choices, to suffering, to choosing a spouse, to educational opportunities, to places to live, and all sorts of other issues. I've heard churches reference the question regarding different aspects of a church's life, finances, programs, and plans. How do we determine God's will? On one level, it gets complicated. Yet on another, it is a very simple issue. If we would truly follow God's will, we would look at God's purposes and attach our choices and decisions to those priorities. Are we willing to seek after God's ways that are higher than our own? In conversation with a recent graduate who was looking at major decisions ahead of them, I had to remind them that God's will was much more basic, much deeper than answering specific questions such as the school they chose to attend, the career path they selected, or which individual they chose to marry. God's real concern was with issues of their character, how they would use those other choices to make the world a better place in which God's heavenly reign might become more visible here on earth. That may not be the traditional way we approach God's will, but I find it a more wholesome way than so much of what passes for discerning God's will in our context. We come to the question of God's will immersed in Greek notions of the three faiths. These entities sat around supposedly deciding the minor specifics of individual lives, ruling out any sense of free will. They determined things from the little stuff, like the color of M&Ms that we first eat and the word order in my sermon. As a consequence, they ruled the larger picture issues of human life, like nations going to war, who survives a grenade or missile attack, who comes down with cancer. That is not the character of God presented by Jesus. It's not the character of God shining through the Hebrew Scriptures. Yahweh lives and moves in dialogue, response, and interaction with human beings who do not always follow the path set before us. When Yahweh intervenes, it seems to be at the very special moments and not as some standard procedure. The will of Yahweh may be announced to us. We're given instructions in how we are to live, but it is then up to us to take hold of those directives, those priorities, and give continuity to Yahweh's creative order for bringing life and abundance into the world we inhabit. If we would understand God's will, we must first understand Yahweh's priorities, greater purposes, and values, then weaving our lives and choices around them. Today's passage from Isaiah sets the stage for addressing one of Yahweh's priorities, a lens of sorts through which we might begin to measure our choices and decisions for determining God's will in our lives. It's a filter which differs drastically from so many others we might use in deciding how to proceed in any given situation. Yahweh has Isaiah declare a call for any who are hungry or thirsty to come and have their needs met at no charge whatsoever. Beyond that, this expression of provision includes more than bread and water, the basic nourishment of the common people in that day and context. It also includes feast foods, the domain of the wealthy or reserved for special occasions, milk and wine. Yahweh's design demanded that all persons have access, not simply to the most basic necessities of life, but also to those things which would raise their standard of living to a level of dignity as full participants in the blessings of a feast. Furthermore, participation in Yahweh's feast was to come without price, due to Yahweh's desire to bless and provide abundantly for all. So much for bootstraps and fighting one's way to have their needs met. Remember the people to whom this land had been given? They had no money with which to buy it. They had no standing in the world. They were captives in Egypt, then refugees roaming as nomads in an uncultivated land. Upon entering Yahweh's land, they were to receive freely of its bounty and share its blessings with all. This was Yahweh's way. It was established as a prerequisite to participating in Yahweh's economy. The land was to be divided equally among all on a regular basis. It was to be repartitioned among all the people living in the land so as to meet everyone's needs. A couple of years ago, I approached the trustees about using part of the church grounds as an orchard. I had no special revelation from God for this. It was a question of determining how to bring our space, facilities, and resources more in line with God's priorities, ways, purposes. It's long bothered me to see vacant buildings used a couple of hours a week. It has also long bothered me that the external parts of a church campus are rarely actively used to bring health, provision, healing, welcome, and a sense of community to those who do not come through our sanctuary doors. I could readily see that the church has invested time and resources in feeding ministries. We have a wet vegetable garden. We have an aquaponics program. We have a blessings box. We have a gleaning ministry. We hold a community Thanksgiving meal each year. We participate in a mobile food pantry. There are other things we could be doing that do not require a huge investment of our time and finances, while adding to advance those divine priorities. I'm no expert at gardening. I do know that a vegetable garden is a lot more work than tending 3 dozen fruit trees or so. I know there's not much more work involved in caring for blueberry bushes than in keeping boxwoods trimmed, shaped, mulched, and growing heavily. We tend to think of provision for ourselves. When my refrigerator and my pantry are full, I am happy and content. Then I look to increase my level of comfort. Yahweh's purposes would reorient my focus a bit. Rather than looking simply at increasing my comfort, my thoughts should turn to making sure others have everything they need. Came across a church building some time ago with a chain over the drive, hanging from it a no trespassing sign. Rather than look beyond themselves as the community shifted about them, rather than attempting to see and address the needs of their neighbors, the church's focus shifted to circling the wagons. It was sad. But it's not really all that different from so many other ways that churches shift our focus onto maintaining the comfort of those who already belong, while ignoring Yahweh's outward call through Isaiah. Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. You who have no money, come, buy and eat without cost, without charge. How often have we seen churches shift their focus from Yahweh's priorities onto attitudes of self-preservation? That's not seeking after God's will, because it runs directly counter to God's higher ways and purposes. The ways of Yahweh do not limit provision and blessing to those who already have what they need. The ways of Yahweh challenge us to look beyond ourselves, even to the nations we do not know. The ways, those who do not know the ways of Yahweh. God's will is not defined by wardrobe and meal selection. It's focused on developing our character after the ways and priorities of God's graceful provision for all. How do our decisions and actions advance those ways and priorities? Do good, do no harm, stay in love with God. That's the higher and more excellent way, as John Wesley phrased it. If we would seek God's will, our decisions should answer how they would advance God's purposes for the welfare of all. After all, God's purposes look far beyond ourselves to meet needs all around us.